Greetings and welcome to tonight's lecture at Union Theological Seminary and our conversation with Dr. Jake Erickson. Before proceeding to our introduction, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in Victoria, BC, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And Union Theological Seminary, our host institution, is in Manhattan, which is on the lands of the Lenape people. This year, as we continue our consideration of questions of theology and animality, we begin by recognizing that these lands and our creaturely kin have long been in the care of others whom we acknowledge with respect and from whom we seek to learn. My name is John Thetominal. I direct the Insight Project at Union Theological Seminary. For those of you who are returning, you know that the Insight Project is sustained by the generosity of Union alumnus Mary Coelho. And the project seeks to do theological reflection in conversation, certainly with the sciences broadly construed, but also to just deepen theological reflection and move it beyond its customary terrain and into considerations that are often regarded as marginal to theology traditionally performed. This year, the theme is animality. In past years, we've talked about nature as a whole. And in the coming year, we hope to launch a series on the nature and meaning of place. We're so glad to have you with us. Now, let me turn to the delightful work of introducing Jake Erickson. Dr. Erickson is Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics in the School of Religion at Trinity College, Dublin. He is also Director of Undergraduate Teaching and Learning for the school and course coordinator for the school's Bachelor of Arts honors program in religion. I don't know how he does all that and continues to be sane and productive and even prolific writer. He's a constructive theologian, a theological ethicist. Erickson writes to evoke an eco-theology of planetary conviviality, the playful and just cherishing of life together in the midst of current ecological crises, ecological injustice, emerging perspectives in the wake of global warming. Jake has taught theology and ethics in the School of Religion since 2016 and has served as the school's director of research. I mean, I read this and it's just implausible that one human being can do all this. Has served as the school's director of research as well as chair of the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Faculty Research Ethics Committee. Prior to Trinity, he taught religion and environmental studies at St. Olaf College. Jake and I realized that we have known each other since his student days at Drew and have been in regular connection since. One of the legacies shared by several students of Jake's mentor, Catherine Keller, is that they share a love for genuinely poetic theological writing. And Jake is certainly part of that community of lovely crafters of theological prose. We'll be talking today about several of his important essays, but I should say we're all eagerly awaiting his forthcoming book on the flood tide of history, climate grief, and the theopoetics of planetary feeling, coming out next year from Fortress Press. He is a prolific author working on a dizzying array of topics. His homepage at Trinity has a list of words under areas of research expertise. We'd be here all evening if I read all those words, but I'll just randomly pick out some of these. Affect theory, Alfred North Whitehead, animal ethics, apophatic theology, ecological theology, elephants, environmental ethics, feminist theology, queer theory, Martin Luther, mysticism, religion, gender, and sexuality. And again, these are just some of the areas in which Jake has made important contributions. Meanwhile, as he's doing all of these things, he is also a distinguished public intellectual, writing not just for the academy, but also for the public at large. Jake, thank you in the middle of doing all those crazy things for being with us. It's really an honor. Just to the folks who are with us, let me just add that you can post questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we prefer the questions there so that we can keep track of them. So welcome, Jake. The floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and thanks for that dizzying introduction. I think I should say that perhaps the expertise is more of an expression of wonder at the possibilities of thinking in a number of these areas. But I'm really grateful for that, and grateful for your collegiality, and grateful for union. I think it's really safe to say that without union's heritage, particularly in the writings of Paul Tillich and Dolores Williams, I wouldn't be a theologian, and I wouldn't be an eco-theologian if not for Larry Rasmussen. So there's a legacy there that is entangled. Also entangled, I should say, that I'm coming to you from Dublin, Ireland. So I'm coming to you not just from a different place, but from a different time. and I'm always reminded of the material connections that make virtual events like this happen in a transatlantic way, where transatlantic cables are laid over histories of shipping and colonialism and waves that tragically entangle into the present. And so I just want to acknowledge that reality coming in. But I guess I'm going to just launch into some of my work here, and talking about, in particular, a series of thematics and questions that I've been working on as of late for this book on the messy connections of climate grief, ecological grief, and the grievances that we experience in the wake of animal losses and extinctions, and in the wake of these messy questions around climate change and climate anxiety. So I'll talk about all of that wrapped in with a bit of a queer perspective. So the title for tonight is Wild Spirituality, Queer Grief, and Grievance in an Age of Extinctions. And I'll say a little bit more about each piece of that title as I go on. But I want to begin with the Christian theology of the Imago Dei, of the human created in the image of God, what I will call a kind of spiritual menagerie of extinctions. And so tonight I sort of want to begin with a garden and with a different sort of garden. And the first garden I want to begin with is a menagerie, is a 19th century traveling performance show, a menagerie of animals. And this remarkable text that follows here comes from the historian Susan Nance's book, Entertaining Elephants. Nance is a historian of animals and performance, particularly in 19th century America. And Entertaining Elephants is a book that chronicles the emergence of elephants in North America, in the American circus. And this is from a particular advertisement for a menagerie, for a performance, for a kind of circus in the mid-19th century in New York City. And it reads like this: in the beginning of the world, as we are taught by the scriptures, God said unto man, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth wherein there is life, I surrender to thee control. And thou shalt have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowls of the air, and over everything that moveth upon the earth shalt thou have dominion. When this power and dominion was given by the Almighty to man, it was intended by his wisdom that he unto whom he had confided so much should become acquainted and familiar with the subjects over which he should exercise his rule. Hence, it became necessary that man should study the history of animated nature, make himself master of a science on which his own happiness depended. England, France, Italy, Germany, in fact, all modern Europe have for centuries back paid unremitting attention to this subject. And that nation in Europe, which has not its natural historical institute, is regarded as on the backward course that leads in the end to semi-barbaric ignorance and folly. Admittance, 25 cents. This is an advertisement for a show to see animals in performance, to see a larger kind of animal entertainment context. And it does so through the use of theological language. Nance remarks that she doesn't know whether mid-19th century Americans would see this and sort of chuckle to themselves. But it also says, I think, something that's culturally in the air, that the theology of the Imago Dei, the theology of dominion, as in Genesis, requires a kind of attentiveness and a kind of mastery to animals. There's a history to this, of course, and a history in ecological theology in the thesis of Lynn White, that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. But I think this particular passage does a number of unique things. Firstly, God nearly gives up control of the universe, or gives up power for human beings to take over the planet and to take over the creatures, to exercise dominion. And dominion is construed as a kind of intellectual inquiry, a kind of sight into the diversity of ecological life with a kind of clarity, a knowing to control, a kind of natural theology, perhaps, or a kind of awareness of the history of not other animals, but animated nature, to make himself master. It's himself, of course. It's masculine. It's about the exercise of man, as in the Imago Dei. And it's purchased, remarkably, that the exercise of the image of God or the dominion of God is something that can in fact be bought. And not only it can be bought, but if it's not, there's a kind of construal that leads to colonialism, of semi-barbaric ignorance and folly if you do not participate in this. The Imago Dei has this long history of kinds of colonial violence. It's materially represented here in Dublin's Dead Zoo, our own natural history museum here in Dublin. It's called the Dead Zoo, as you can kind of perceive, precisely because of the panoply of taxidermied animals, some of which are now extinct, some of which are now endangered. And the mode of the museum itself is to be a museum, or is now at least a museum of a museum of what a mid-19th century museum would look like. A sense that taxiderming animals allows one to get to know them intimately, biologically, in a way of controlling and mastering the natural world. It's a really interesting space. Willie James Jennings, in his recent work on creation, I think says it quite brilliantly, that while Christian theology's distinction between humanity and the rest of creation matters, the image of God over other creatures, this distinction has formed within modernity to reflect the conceptual split between culture and nature, as well as the disciplinary split between the humanities and science. It also draws life from colonial imperialist modes of knowledge formation that juxtaposed white, Western, masculine science over and against non-white, non-Western, feminine, and indigenous knowledge. The Imago Dei is construed particularly as anthropocentric, androcentric, and an exercise of violent power over and over again. The indecent and queer theologian Marcella Altos Reed noted this as well in The Queer God, that the traditional reading of Genesis has made of mastery and dominion over women and nature a theological virtue. Even in the more benign readings concerned with the concept of stewardship in relationship to the environment, especially those that are very more common now as stewardship, as ecological care, the fundamental colonial notion and motion of patriarchy persists. persists in heterosexist ways into the present. The Imago Dei is not necessarily a safe creature at the end of the day. Which leads us into this current context, the impacts of some of these theological ideas in the present. Lynn White, like I said, famously indicted Christianity for having part of the causes of our ecological crisis. And I'm suspicious of that kind of overarching grand narrative, but you can see in these historical documents, both physical and textual, that the role of the Imago Dei does function with a kind of violence, and one that has impacts such that the ecological world has been continuously extracted from, and more than human animals have been exterminated over and over again. So I re-up this picture of the dead zoo because there's this existential feeling that I have when I walk into this space of being not necessarily in a scientific institution, but instead in a kind of tomb or in kind of graveyard or in a kind of memorial to a loss of life and to the violence that human beings have done historically to the rest of the more than human world. We live in an age of extinctions and of the Sixth Extinction. Of course, the Sixth Extinction, unlike the rest in that human beings have caused it. Sometimes it's enwrapped in what we call the Anthropocene, but I've been more interested lately in what E.O. Wilson calls it as the Eremocene, the age of loneliness. This time where the Imago Dei has constructed itself so isolatedly and has wiped out so much of the biotic life and creaturely life around us that the human being finds itself alone. The modern individual succeeds and is left on the shores of its own violence. And in that, I think we experience and we can articulate in the present a number of kinds of forms of grief and formations of grief that identify themselves as that sort of gut-wrenching feeling in the wake of this age of loneliness, that of ecological grief or climate grief or animal grief. And these three do different things, though I think in common parlance and in common articulations of this language of ecological grief, everything kind of gets collapsed into one, but I want to pull them all out and talk about them in different ways. Extinction raises a series of what I would say are affective, emotional, and eco-spiritual questions. They're questions that don't simply occupy the spiritual practice of knowing the rest of the human world to control it, but they're experiences of effectively engaging with the ecological world and with other animals. How do we understand extinction? What is it? Do we have moral responsibility ourselves to mark losses when a species goes extinct? What's lost when a species goes extinct, materially, culturally, ecologically? What kind of pain or experience is present in those experiences? What is human agency is in these extinctions, in the fuzzy zones of natures and cultures? Where are human beings responsible? Where are they not? Are there places where humans are not? Can human losses bear witness to losses beyond their own capacity to name them? Can we, in our own sense of felt grief, fully comprehend the amount of biotic life that has been lost in the last 100 years, for instance? Species going extinct that some of them we haven't even named yet. By what right do human beings learn from these losses? But what right, and do we have any right to actually grieve them ourselves in the experience of it? How do we consider the grief of other animals or the emotional life of other animals and the complicated ways that grief manifests itself? These are all live questions for me in my research right now. But to get some contours on ecological grief, here's one definition from Ashley Kinsella and Neville Ellis that the ecological grief is, they say, the grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. So experienced losses of species or anticipated losses of species, ones that might come again towards us, whether they be immediate or gradual over time. This is one definition of ecological grief, and it's one that is helpful to get a grounding, but I don't think captures the entire picture. There's a number of textures to the emotions that we feel in relationship to the loss of animal lives. On one hand, there's things like apocalypse or climate fatigue, that we feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of ethical questions that are in the present, by the amount of history that is weighted upon us. We feel that our activism or our ethical choices don't have a whole lot of weight in the present. There's anticipatory loss of the losses that we know that we will experience and that are inevitable in the wake of climate change or in the wake of species decline. And one way to articulate this would be this concept in extinction of ghost species, where there are just a few particular animals of a species left, and they will inevitably go extinct. And what do we do to name that loss or anticipated loss? There's solastalgia, termed by Glenn Albrecht, about what happens in an ecological place when you feel like your home has left you behind rather than you have left home. There's intergenerational trauma, the fact that a lot of the extinctions we experience are accelerating, and a lot of the climate change that is impacting in the present exceeds our own lifetimes, that there are things that we've inherited and have impacted across multiple generations and will impact into future generations. There's ambiguous loss, a sense that we don't fully know what's being lost, and sometimes folks and other species disappear without even our full awareness of what's happening. There's climate anxiety, uncertainty, and there's a lot of irony. Nicole Seymour, the queer eco-critic, talks about this experience of being an environmental activist and knowing inevitable loss is present, but also recognizing that there's a bit of still need to do something. All of these sort of cluster in this ecological loss. But more, and it's tied in with the initial picture of the Imago Dei. The Australian geographer Leslie Head says that those in the affluent West are actually grieving quite a bit for the loss of the modern self, or grieving precisely for exercising the Imago Dei as dominion, or exercising it as power over other creatures, and its dependence on a future characterized by hope. This sense that for some folks and some affluent folks, life was going along just fine. And in that power and privilege, what is being lost is a sense of that particular privileged future. And it's being mixed in with all of these feelings of ecological grief as well. Or characterized by hope, a sense of a certain future. And I think we can critique certain languages of saving the planet, for instance, for our children and our children's children. Does that language particularly imagine a certain kind of family or a certain kind of community? Who are our children? And why are they just human children? Why not planetary life? So this question of what kind of future we're imagining, and what we're imagining we're losing when we're imagining loss and feeling loss. Sarah Jaquette Ray, in a recent article in the Scientific American, wrote that the white response, this is just last month, the white response to climate change is literally suffocating to people of color. Climate anxiety can operate like white fragility, sucking up all the oxygen in the room and devoting resources toward appeasing the dominant group. How can we make sure that climate anxiety or climate grief or ecological grief is harnessed for climate justice? So a few observations about climate grief that I'm working with and ecological grief. Firstly, that ecological grief is not one thing. It's entangled in histories of power, understandings of what it means to be human, in terms of racialization, in terms of animalization, in terms of formations of androcentrism, masculine centeredism, heterosexism. Ecological grief manifests itself in numbers of ways in human bodies and in more than human bodies. Secondly, it's multiscalar. That is to say that we experience grief on one hand sometimes for our own locales, for the loss of animal life in our own communities and in our own places that we know intimately and well. But we also know that that loss is planetary and happens on a planetary level. It's also multi-temporal. We know of losses in the past, and we are aware of slow losses in the present. Animal species going extinct over and over and over again, and ones that will. Instead of grief, grieving itself is not a passive act. We experience grief quite often for these ecological losses, but grieving as a process is not just purely passive. We don't simply grieve and go through, and stages happen to us as a lot of popular imaginaries around grief happen. But grieving is an active and creative process. It's relational. It reaches out to connect. It engages in creating and relearning, intersecting with others. It's not an event that happens, it's a process, and a process sometimes that repeats itself over and over and over again. And it's not purely rational, but it's sensual, that we don't simply get to know the rational world around us so to control it, but instead we begin to take in the full aesthetics of our other creaturely life. So my classes today, we're talking about soundscape ecology and the sheer amount of loss of the sounds of birdsong or animal life and of certain ecologies that have been lost over the last years. But here's my question, and in particular for us in ecological contexts and in animal advocacy contexts, and it's raised by Judith Butler in this art exhibit, Between Grief and Grievance, or Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. Judith Butler's article is called Between Grief and Grievance, A New Sense of Justice. And she asks, grief and grievance, loss and the call to justice, how do they relate? How do these experiences of loss and experiences of other animal loss relate to drives and questions of justice? Butler uses the language of grievance as a way of asking, where do we petition to for justice? Particularly, where do we petition to for justice, and how do we motivate grief towards justice when the structures by which, whether they be colonial, whether they be histories of racial or gender injustice, are the only structures that are there for us oftentimes? Where do we appeal to, or where do we create new places of moving? So this has been my question for quite a while now, is how do I move this ecological sense of grief in a just way, attentive to its own complications and histories, towards a sense of justice and solidarity for the other animal world. And one of the ways that I do that is through this emergent field called queer ecology, and what I'm calling the queer ecology of creation in Christian theology, queer eco-theology, work that engages in transforming grief and felt emotions around our ecological lives, and grievance in all of its active work in raising questions of justice and the limitations it quite often runs into, and the needs for space that it needs. How do we work through this? And I'd like to say that I think this intersection of queer theory and ecological life is one particular place. Queer ecologies really jump into this creative and constructive space of not simply advocating for LGBTQ inclusion in society, but actually asking what particular insights and creative and poetic or theoretical or reflective insights do queer voices have to actually illumine the ecological world in which we're a part. And once we find that the world is in fact not just something that can be viewed necessarily with queer eyes, but it is in fact queer already in many ways, and with different definitions of what it means to be queer and from LGBTQ plus perspectives. These are some of the names of folks doing that work and or have done that work or heritages of that work, and we can go into those. But two that I need to name with regards to Christian theology. Firstly, J. Michael Clark's 1993 book, Beyond Our Ghettos, Gay Theology and Ecological Perspective, noted that gay perspectives on eco-theology will insist what we see is not just a devaluing or lowering of value, not simply a devaluing of the ecological world, which leads to dominion and exploitation, but a disvaluing, which strips away all value, and which thereby leads to exclusion, to being disposable, to being acceptable for extinction. I think it connects to the opening sort of advertisement that I shared with us earlier, the sense that the scientific knowing of the natural world through this menagerie as a way, as nearly a spiritual practice of owning dominion, doesn't simply sort of look down on others with power, but actively exhausts and extracts and strips away all value, which leads to a kind of exclusion, things being disposable for extinction. Dan Spencer, Gaia and Gaia, Ethics, Ecology, and the Erotic, picked up the particular animal dimensions of this. Long consigned to the animalistic side of the nature-culture dichotomy, lesbians and gay men may have a particular sensitivity to classifying something as an animal or animalistic in order to justify exploiting it. He continued that where anti-gay discourse draws on the self-contradictory positions of condemning lesbians and gay men for both being unnatural, where natural sexuality is read as procreative heterosexuality and too close to nature, in the sense of homosexual behavior being lower or animalistic outside the boundaries of acceptable human culture. Queer folks are often excluded for being unnatural or being too close to the rest of the ecological world. And this sensitivity of this dynamism of Eric Derelmeyer last week referred to it as the zone of indistinction for queer folks, moves us into a different kind of perspective and sensitivity to the ways that animals are spoken of and the ways that other human beings are animalized. And so some constructive queer themes in eco-theology, and I'll come here to a close in a few seconds, but some themes that emerge that I think that are really important is attentive to liminal spaces or spaces that have alternate ecological aesthetics. Quite often queer folks are pushed to the edges of society, pushed to particular kinds of locations, queer clubs, gardens, ecological spaces, rural spaces where they can escape the kind of gaze of that heterosexist imago Dei of watching and dominating. There's a sense in which, secondly, that there's more of an appreciation towards felt ecologies of creation in imaginative ways, not just the rational ways that scientific taxonomizes other animals, but in fact, Spencer proposes engaging the world with a kind of erotic ecology, whereas one's attentive to the desires and the eco-social desires that connect us in multiple ways. It might direct us towards ways that nature is bifurcated or ripped apart and ordered and tamed, so to speak. And quite often queer voices work precisely within that indeterminacy. So rather than talking about nature being out there and culture being in here, and culture is where LGBTQ culture is. In fact, we talk about the whole of the ecological world having a certain kind of performativity and an indeterminacy. Karen Barad works on what she calls nature cultural performativity. We can work through different forms of multi-species kinship as queer kinship. Chosen families for LGBTQ perspectives don't simply include other queer folks or folks that may not be biological families, but in fact include a whole host of other species in varieties of ways, pets, etc. And lastly, another point that turns to the material and biotic care of queer bodies and the ecological world, and access to healthcare and medical care and spiritual care literate to LGBTQ needs is a very significant ethical concern. And I think one of the ways that you see this manifesting itself is right at the same time in contemporary American politics, where movement is attempting to happen around forms of climate activism. At the same time, you have a number of anti-trans legislations happening across the United States, and they're not disconnected in my mind. And so finally, just to wrap it up, I want to sort of imagine a kind of proposal or a constructive proposal for a kind of wild spirituality, that one that tries to rethink that initial menagerie and garden into a different kind of garden, a queer garden, a garden of wild spirituality. And I want to do so with a classic scene of grief, in fact, that of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane in the holy days around Easter is, for me as a theologian, probably the most interesting out of all of them, from Good Friday to Holy Saturday to Easter Sunday. There's something about this emotional scene in Gethsemane that constantly draws me forward, because it seems so very different than the sort of redemption narratives and middling narratives that happen throughout the rest of the holy days. So I want to think about that space as a liminal space and as a potential space to think through a kind of queer eco-spirituality. In queer ecology at the moment, Jack Halberstam's book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, The Disorder of Desire, Halberstam writes that the wild does not simply name a space of non-human animality that must submit to human control, as we've sort of talked about, or as I mentioned very, very early on, this sort of idea of the wild as something to be dominated and known as an exercise of dominion. But it also questions the hierarchies of being that have been designed to mark and patrol the boundaries between the human and everything else. That is to say that oftentimes that which is designated as wild and to be controlled by dominion the category of the wild isn't simply a kind of oppressive category where we determine the wild is out there and it is to be colonized and controlled from this colonial imago Dei. But in fact, this idea of the wild as a space, and as a space that fundamentally causes a disruption in the ordered categories that we've inherited from modernity, as a constant disruption, a potential disruption of our understanding of what it means to be human, and a potential understanding of even these dichotomies of culture and the wild, or domesticated and the wild. And the wild is something that can really occur anywhere when a kind of disorder happens or occurs in any particular moment. Halberstam points out the possibilities of entering into that indeterminate space of the wild, something that's not simply under human control, that has that's not solely under the control of human boundaries, and does something a little bit different. And I think that the Garden of Gethsemane does this a little bit, actually, or at least I want to sort of tell a kind of story, what Donna Haraway would call a speculative fabulation, and what Ken Stone, in his article, a book chapter title, Reading the Hebrew Bible in an Age of Extinctions, that turning to different kinds of biblical narratives might open up new perspectives on the ecological. And so how do we tell different stories, and stories that attend to queer spaces, or stories that tell or retell biblical stories with ecological themes, with a kind of queer indeterminacy or disorderly sense. And the scene in Gethsemane where Jesus says, goes to the Garden of Gethsemane in the Synoptics, or the Mount of Olives, or in John, it's not there at all, and says, "I'm deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake," he tells the disciples, and the disciples constantly fall asleep. And he says, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He returns, finds them, the disciples asleep again. And this is the scene, of course, where the soldiers come with Judas, and Judas kisses Jesus, and Jesus is arrested. But this space of Jesus entering a garden, a lot of biblical writers have pointed out, or a lot of biblical studies writers have pointed out, that Jesus constantly returns to these liminal and wild spaces. In Mark, Jesus goes to be with the wild beasts, for instance. This space of Gethsemane as an ecological space, a garden in a city, and for queer folks, gardens oftentimes become escapes and places to meet under, without being under the watchful eye of heterosexist formulations of society. And to express grief and to express emotional distress in this space is to express a kind of anticipatory grief for a loss, for the loss of Jesus's life, for the concern about the movement itself. And what's interesting about this passage is that early writers and early quote unquote pagan writers who encountered the Garden of Gethsemane often accuse the portrayal of this Jesus, who is supposed to be a hero, as being particularly effeminate, or embodying a kind of effeminate masculinity. This is not what a hero is supposed to do, to fall down to the ground, to weep, say, "I'm deeply grieved," to express emotion and a bit of nerves. And Jesus is being a bit of a diva here. And if I might do a queer reading of that, I might. But I think the expression of emotion becomes a space in which we might be invited into thinking of Jesus engaging in a wild performance in the Garden of Gethsemane of grief, in between the disciples who are exhausted from the particular ongoings of the movement, and the imperial powers, which are always imminent and on the horizon. Jesus sits in the midst of this lush space and expresses grief as a mode of connection. So it becomes a kind of queer performance to me of a different kind of masculinity. And of course, this is a story that I'm telling, right? It allows for thinking of the scene, Jesus alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus as the human being who stands alone in a space, noticing the loss, feeling isolated within a larger movement, wanting to express agency and wanting to invite the disciples to participate and to express solidarity for that particular movement. It's a space that disorders, I think. It's a space that Jesus disorders, constantly rouses the disciples from exhaustion and invites them to think with him. And it constantly disorders the sense of or at least it holds off the sense of imminent threat to actually take time to express grief and genuine loss. I think that this language of Jesus saying, "Please take the cup from me," might be a kind of invitation to an alertness, a relational alertness to social injustice, and one that asks for a kind of disorder beyond the limitations of his inability to appeal to the sort of take this cup from me if it's possible, and it doesn't seem to become possible, and yet he's still expressing agency and activity and a sense of planetary feeling. I call this the queer ecology of creation a little bit, and the theopoetics of planetary feeling, trying to think through the ways that we interact in ecological contexts, express felt emotion, and also listen to the felt emotion of a place in intricate ways. The poet Mary Oliver reimagines the scene of the Garden of Gethsemane, and she says that perhaps Jesus said, "Wait with me," and maybe the stars did. Maybe the wind wound itself into a silver tree and didn't move. Maybe the lake far away where he once walked, as on a blue pavement, lay still and waited, wild awake. This scene of wild awakeness being a potential imagination where Jesus is expressing a kind of queer disorder, and simultaneously that the ecological relations that he finds himself in are bearing witness to that sense of mutual grief or ecological grief. And this is what I'll end with. And I think it's a good visual representation of what I'm trying to get at. And of course, this is a sense of a thought experiment in a sort of way that much of the iconographic tradition that picks up Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane displays Jesus in a kind of triangle, flanking a triangle. Jesus lifting up and saying, "Please take the cup from me," just as this cup is coming down of responsibility. The disciples are falling asleep behind him, and yet he sits in this lush kind of wilderness as a space that's sort of revitalizing his sense of presence, and revitalizing his sense to sort of recruit these other human animals into the ecological world of the garden with him. And in the distance, the Roman soldiers and Judas are marching on imminently in an anticipatory way of the grief and the loss that they will experience. But one thing that, and it comes out very fragilely in this picture, that the Roman soldiers stand within a landscape that is utterly ecologically destitute, that the trees are in fact empty. And this sense that Jesus's solidarity in an ecological space that is caught between the sleeping disciples and the Roman power, and constantly revitalizing itself with this attention to the cup. So it's quite a sort of poetic articulation that might go in different ways. And I realize I've gone a little long here, but I think the constructive possibility of that might be where I want to go. So I'll sort of stop there.
Jake, I really miss human, being surrounded by human companionship, and in moments like this, where we should be giving you a rousing, rousing applause for a really provocative and beautiful and deep and moving reflections. But I am confident that others are doing this for the gift you've given us. There's so much to think through, so much to feel through, and much of this is new to me. So this is a treat. This wasn't just what I've already read from Jake. So thank you for that, for taking us along on the journey that you're currently undertaking in completing your book. So there's so much to be thought here. But let me ask this: there's the lecture begins with a way of thinking about the scientific that is really intriguing. I mean, among the things that, this Insight project is trying to do is to get something going in the conversation between theology and science. It doesn't have to be a happy hand-holding conversation. It can be agonistic. And I think you actually opened that up here by suggesting that at least some ways of construing the scientific are marked by a deadness, like that landscape, right? This is an old theme, this whole we murder to dissect. Mm-hmm. But I know you, and I know that you delight in a close scientific attention too. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing, right? There really is attention in that practice of science. And, for those of us like, I think you, who think of attention itself as a kind of holy thing, a la Simone Weil, what are we to do here? This is strange, not in a queer sense, but in a disturbing sense. This attention, the meticulous attention, but not an attention marked by wildness of wonder, of grief and joy, but something clinical and troubling. I wonder if you felt through that odd jostling that I've just sort of tried to map.
No, I think the thing for me that I constantly think about is the disposition in which science is done, and in that opening image, it's a desire for exercising dominion in a kind of penetrating way that completely removes all of the mystery of the more than human world, i.e., these are wonders, come to know them, and once you've known them, they are products for you to know, and that's a kind of exercising of dominion. And it's not just clinical in the sense of being a kind of dissecting or vivisectionist kind of mentality, but that piece at the beginning also says that this is for the sake of human happiness. This is what makes humans happy, and it makes me think that just to pick up on the felt way that you've named that question, that there's a kind of false happiness in a sense of constructing the imago Dei, or constructing what it means to be human, that says I'm an enclosed system, which is not scientifically accurate, but it's I'm an enclosed system. I regulate myself with a kind of masculinity. I know the world around me because this is wonderful, gold and glory to be conquered, and empty and known, to be consumed and exhausted in a full way. And that makes me sort of gluttonously happy, versus a kind of science that adheres to a kind of scientific humility in knowing that there's always going to be certain edges that are going to have a kind of maybe wonder that press back against the human, and maybe a kind of scientific process that is aware of the ways that it's told its stories. So a scientific process that actually honors with a kind of humility in doing, and a scientific process that knows with a kind of humility what it is, and its own historical locatedness in time. And just as much as that's a story too. I don't know if that's getting at I think maybe sort of ecological humility versus ecological arrogance. I mean, it might be as simple as that, as sort of Anne Primavesi sort of phrased it, or Sally McFaig, or any number of eco-theologians.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So much to think, as I said, and feel through. I want to turn to the central role that Imago Dei played in this lecture.
Mm.
You have, I think, both in earlier writing and in this talk, shown us that that it functions, the idea functions to undergird anthropological exceptionalism and put us on a pedestal that disconnects us and places us on another level and apart from our animal kin. But interestingly, in your writing, you actually don't pitch it. And one might hear this lecture and think that you would come down on the side of, well, let's tank this idea. It's irredeemable. It can't itself be saved. But you don't, and instead you seek to reconfigure it. Tell us a little bit about why you don't pitch it, and then just a hint as to how it is that you're trying to save it and to engage in a creative theopoetics of the idea.
That's a great question. And it's a great question because it's one that occupies me quite a bit. And I would say that I think on most days I want to ditch it. In fact, I find it to be such a hugely problematic idea, not necessarily on its own, but in the ways that it's been embodied in the heritages of Christian theology, entangled, especially in modern formations, but in other formations as well. So there are two reasons why I don't pitch it. The first reason is because the language of the Imago Dei has been so important for certain forms of human rights discourse. And I want to acknowledge that there are traditions that take that up to argue for the inherent dignity of marginalized peoples. Though I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not a scholar of human rights. I have some great colleagues who are. The other reason why I don't pitch it is because of I want to refuse a kind of anachronistic colonial gesture, because I think that in the original, where Imago Dei is entangled with languages of dominion and stewardship, for an ancient Hebrew writer, in a complicated ecological world trying to eke out an existence, trying to have a sense of stewardship in its original historical context seems to me to have a very different kind of ecological context with very different kinds of implications. And it just seems to me to be, in certain moments, a kind of contemporary hubris to say it's intrinsically bad. I'm willing to say it's bad now, but there is that sort of, I do want to have some reference to historical writers who used it differently, and who were peoples who knew their ecology, as Holmes Rolston has said, knew their ecology at a native range. And that's the word, those are the words that they used for that native range. They didn't know about atoms or DNA sequencing or certain forms of cosmology that are in more modern contexts, but they knew ecologies at a native range, and stewardship and dominion was one way that they navigated them. And analyzing how the impacts of those are in that time are probably more for a biblical scholar than for a theologian. But that being said, I have immense problems with, not just because of the Lynn White thesis calling it to have a kind of anthropocentrism of value. I think that's one instance of it. I think there's, and that's why I started with the piece that I did today, that I want to show historically, materially, where this idea has actually committed a whole lot of harm towards other animals. But I also think that there's a certain kind of anthropocentrism that happens among Christian communities that focus in and hone in on one of many creation stories in the biblical canon. And the one that they focus in on and love to live up says human beings are created in the imago Dei to have dominion and subdue the earth. And it seems to me to be this utter lack of creativity precisely when the world needs creative storytelling of alternative ways of imagining human and animal relationships, to simply only talk about the priestly narrative of Genesis. When you have wisdom literature, when you have Job, when you have John, and they all do different things and they have their own problems with them. But it just seems to me to be a kind of this sinkhole of theology, that the imago Dei holds all of this power over over ecological theology and over animal theology. It's that thing that constantly beckons us back to it, and yet I think it's something that we so need to escape. and I should say this, that for many Protestant traditions, the imago Dei is not a crux of theological anthropology, and that is to say that the imago Dei is, in one reading, wiped out in the fall, and therefore, where do you look to find participation in the image of God? It's in the practices and politics of the life of Jesus instead. So there are ways in construing it differently, and I'll play with those. But I think that's kind of the labyrinth of where I'm going. Some days I'm really angry about it. Some days I'm perfectly fine to play with it, and maybe that's the irreverent move.
All right, the time has come to field some questions from the audience, and interesting. There's so many good ones here. I wonder if we can field one of the earliest questions, maybe the earliest question that came in from our friend Anna Blado. Yeah. Could you say more about the connections you are intuiting between climate justice movements in climate change and the waves of anti-trans bills proliferating?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. That's a great question. It's the concern that I have right now in for environmental politics is largely an urgent one, that we need to really sort of ramp up our game if we're going to sort of limit emissions and limit some of the worst effects of climate change. And it's just striking to me that at this particular moment, when a certain argument that could be construed as for the planetary or natural world, a kind of counter-political argument attempting to sort of undercut that wants to make for a certain kind of heterosexist biological argument as a way of distracting from other ecological concerns. So it's almost as if, in a kind of a public theological way, there's a controversy over the language of nature, and there's a controversy over the language of protecting nature. Yes. And in anti-trans circles, protecting nature means protecting that certain heterosexist biotic imaginary, and that is fundamentally antagonistic to gender and sexuality in human beings and creatures as we know it. And at the other hand, it's pulling away from this conversation about what it means to conserve and protect the ecological world that is often called nature in its material forms. I think that's probably what I can, there's more I'm sure I could say in terms of the tracing the lines of dark money and funding from organizations that I'm sure are sharing actually in many ways. Yeah.
Robin Henderson Espinoza has a question. Jake, I'm curious about the role of race as it relates to grief and grievance, and how do we account for that and include racialized grief? And they mention Anzaldúa.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin. And Anzaldúa, of course, is welcome. I don't think there's one response to Robin's question here, and I think the way that Butler plays with grief and grievance is in classic Butler style multivalent, and that is to say that there's a linear link between how one understands loss and injustice and its move towards the cry for justice and where it cries to for justice. There is also the sense in which, in any of these contexts, grievance occurs in multiple racialized formations. So, for instance, the grief and grievance of the murdering of Black folks by police in the U.S. Is met by the grievance and protest of white supremacy that storms the Capitol, and so these movements of racializing what grievances are present and how those are functioning is utterly vital, but they happen in multiple ways. The other thing I'd say is one of the things that's been striking this week for me. I'm many ties to Minneapolis, and so have been checking in with my communities there. And in Dante Wright's murder, in the wake of it, one thing that was striking on Twitter was this constant call for communities to have space to grieve. Just the pure desire of having a space to grieve and express protest. And that space to grieve is, as many noted on Twitter, or sort of articulated on Twitter, that space to grieve was cut down and impinged upon by folks in riot gear, and not just with folks in riot gear, but also on a night at the beginning of Ramadan, such that where curfew is settled in, and suddenly it's not just racialized formations of grieving spaces and whether vigils can happen or not, but it's also about religious observances and Islamophobia and the questions and intersections there. So there's a particular example where I think there's actually multiple levels and articulations and complexities, maybe even hybridities of grief that need to be named. And I think it's vital for the climate justice movement in particular, because it oftentimes environmental movements become such white spaces that naming and pulling apart these senses of grief and the grieving. Ashley Consolo, who I quoted in the talk, works with indigenous communities in the Arctic, for instance, and the grief over the loss of traditional cultures is not the same grief of a white suburban family wondering what the next 10 years are going to look like for their kid. It's not the same, and so articulating those is a matter of ecological justice in my mind.
This brings me to a question that I had wanted to ask, and that is, I mean, I maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is a sign of my provinciality, but I know no contemporary theological voice that thinks so carefully about the place of grief in theology. In your writing, you say outside of pastoral care, affect, emotions, or feeling rarely get much consideration in systematic or constructive theology. So, and then you go on to say, I want my theology to learn how to grieve better, especially in a time of pandemic. Say a little bit about that. I mean, how did you arrive here? And I think you're right. I think you're right to say that grief is not a central topic in constructive or systematic theology. So I appreciate that you've named something pretty profound and you want us to rectify it. So I welcome further reflections on that.
So I think I've always been interested in the genealogy and theology that sort of recovered a God of pathos, or sort of, whether it be through sort of like Moltmann's Crucified God, or whether it be through a kind of process theological frame where God is feeling the world. One thing that I'm often missing in those discourses, and I realize that there's oftentimes a necessity for speaking with abstractions about feeling or compassion or passion, but the particular diversity of emotional life that goes into and is entailed by saying that divinity has a kind of pathos to it, or that Christian theology is to be attentive to kinds of passion. There's not a whole lot of specifics articulated. I think that's changing in recent years. You have Elaine Padilla's book on divine enjoyment, and that particular enjoyment and pleasure and fiesta. You have, I think, maybe not necessarily particularly immediately related to grief, but definitely will be, is my colleague Beatrice Maravich's book coming out, Sister Death, Political Theology in an Age of Extinction. And I'm also inspired by Deborah Bird Rose's reflections, the late Deborah Bird Rose, on grief, and in particular how she relates this book Wild Dog Dreaming about the murdering of dingoes, and she dream weaves Aboriginal stories alongside of the Job's grief tradition. So it's so striking to me that Christianity is a religion of grieving in gardens, and yet there's not much really that makes that sense of connection of the grieving life as being a kind of theological task that's not simply just about pastorally getting folks through. When it does happen, it's with the theodicy question. But I think why grieving in particular is the revolution in grieving research, that grieving is a kind of creative art, and it seems to me that leaves a space for theological language to say, if we're going to talk about theology being a creative art itself, if we need theology to be an art of living on a dying planet, or damaged planet, Anna Singh's language, then that means that theology is and can be a practice of grieving, one way or the other, and it may be that someone needs to write that kind of theology in a more theopoetic way, and I choose to go towards that. My whole life is, and it's somewhat an autobiographical question for me. Grew up in a very young family. I had 4 of my great-grandparents and a bunch of great aunt and uncles. All 4 of my grandparents lived on a farm, and I have just my one grandmother left. And so my whole life has been this sort of constant experience of being in an ecological location and seeing that profound theological reflection and profound communal connection always seems to me to happen experientially in these grief workspaces. That's an idiosyncratic thing to my own spiritual autobiography, but I think it's why I'm motivated to it. But I also think that there's something political there that's really possible in thinking about how our writing creates and grieves and reconnects and relearns, and might even need to do the grieving work of what it means to grieve an old concept of God, that an all-powerful God that looks very straight, that maybe theology hasn't done that grief work yet, and once we do, maybe something new might come forth, maybe not, but I'm not quite sure. So a bunch of other things.
Oh, that's beautiful, Jake. I'm so grateful. I'm mindful of our time. I'm going to squeak in one more question, and that is painful because there are so many urgent questions here. So let me take Anna Fisk's question here. How can we keep the concept of wild as one that is queer, radical, and interspecies, not serving conservative conservation efforts of boundaries and depeopling, or wildness that is the domain of white cis men overcoming the limits of nature? Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, hi, Anna. I didn't know you were here. It's such an important question for me because there is a long tradition, especially in American conservation traditions, of the wild being that sort of rugged masculine space. And it's a wild masculine space that's out there. Or it's the construal of the garden as the North American continent as the sort of pristine and untouched garden that needs to be cultivated and right. So, but connecting it to your question on contemporary conservation, I think that the language of wild it can't function under an old understanding of a division between nature and culture, firstly. If we allow the wild to be dictated by that binary, which it often is in these political arrangements in national conservation ways, then it won't have much guts. If, however, we take the wild in a more capacious sense, that there is an element of wildness, or can be an element of wildness in anything. William Cronin does this work with the trouble with wilderness essay, which is important for me. And Max Olschlager does a bit as well, where if we talk about wilderness or wildness as this sort of living profusion and indeterminacy that's constantly swirling in all creaturely and material life, then that can do something different. If I claim my wildness as something that a larger structure refuses of me, it gives me a different space. It can give me an internal space to refuse that broader structural injustice. It also, if I can also trouble people's perspective on ecological, I can say that in perhaps a cheeky way, that my house or the place that I'm living, the apartment, is a wild space. How do I understand that as a wild space? What is strange to me? What is disruptive of my own sense of self-sufficiency as a human being? And I think that's why it works. And this may be where it's good to to press back at me on it, that it may work more on a localized eco-spiritual level. And the question is can that wildness, with a sense and attention to justice, can it get political agency in a broader context? And I think that there are ways that it can. I think, for example, that the way that children sort of engaged and launched a number of the climate marks is a kind of unruly wildness that I want. And I mean, I don't want to say sort of wild children running around or anything like that, but it is a disruption to the ways that the world has been structured before them. And I would like to say that that's wild. It's wild in the sense that it refuses order. It's wild in the sense that it's attractive of a kind of ecology that can be sustaining without cultivation. And it's wild in the sense that it's fierce. It has that, and Jack Halberstam uses this word. Halberstam says it's sort of a kind of practice of the pharaoh, of a kind of fierceness or ferocity, and sort of in sort of queer culture, we say that's fierce, it's a kind of way of talking about resilience and resistance simultaneously. So that's maybe initially what I'd say. But yeah.
Well, friends, it's the time has come for us to thank Jake for being with us, for giving us this wild and indeed fierce talk, and enticing us still further into anticipation for your forthcoming book, where I was already kind of salivating, and now I'm even more so. So thank you for being here with us. Again, thanks to our audience, for our attendees for coming. My special thanks to Ian Reese for doing all the tech for this. And general gratitude for Mary Coelho and her generosity in supporting this series as well. Now, a word, some of you know that Jake now will come to my class. So to the class, while you're listening, we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Take care all.